Derek Canning became the first person in the UK to be imprisoned for a wildlife crime related to wild birds. It was a criminal case almost entirely led by the RSPB, which used a dodgy DNA testing system developed by one of its trustees to prove his guilt. The investigation was riddled with flaws, and legal procedures were ignored at nearly every stage. But it is still being held up by the charity as a landmark case in its war on bird crime. Another case where the welfare of birds was less important than a successful prosecution, and Chapter 8 in RSPB Uncovered, the Missing Birdcrime Files. On the 6th of July, 1993, Derek Canning's home near Hexham was raided by the police and the RSPB. Among those present were RSPB investigators Karen Bradbury, Guy Shorrock, and Duncan McNiven, PCJ White of Northumbria Police, veterinary nurse Anne Victoria Wakelam, and someone from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. The warrant was issued to White, but his name is crossed out, and Shorrock's written above it in what appears to be Shorrock's handwriting. It seems unlikely the document was altered before it was signed by the magistrate, as it would have been initialed. So who applied for the warrant? If it was Shorrock, on what grounds was he allowed to make the application, given that he is a member of the public with no legal authority or powers of law enforcement? If the warrant was unlawfully obtained, all the evidence was inadmissible. Canning lived with his parents, and his mother was alarmed when McNiven began filming. Shorrock and Bradbury insisted the footage would not be broadcast, and was only for use in the legal proceedings.
So the video's only run if there's something wrong?
The video is going to film what we're going to do with the birds and filming the birds.
And if there's nothing wrong, what happens to the video?
Well, it's not going to get published anyway, it's for the benefit of
Well, I've seen it on television.
No, it's for evidence, so the video's only taken for evidence.
It's for the magistrate.
But about 6 weeks after the raid, it was shown on the Cook Report. The programme makers claim that Canning phoned producer Chris Neal to offer him 14 illegal peregrine falcons. There is no recording of this, as it never happened.
Chris Neal has been threatened with violence. He was also offered a batch of 14 allegedly wild peregrines. A police raid followed. In these crates, soiled and sorry-looking peregrine chicks await sale by a falconer who should have known better and is now awaiting his day in court.
The charity claimed Canning had taken birds from the wild and was trying to pass them off as captive bred. The warrant does not mention taking blood from all the birds, yet this was clearly the intention and is the focus of a large part of McNiven's video. Bradbury appears unprepared for the task of leading the raid, in which Canning's birds were subject to extreme stress during blood taking, and several died after being confiscated. Ironically, Bradbury was forced to resign from the RSPB after questioning the integrity of RSPCA staff. In former government veterinarian Peter Scott's analysis of the blood collection, he describes Wakelam's technique as amateurish and unprofessional. The birds were not hooded to calm them, and they scream in protest throughout and are seriously stressed by the process. This was not welfare-friendly, wrote Scott. There are several failed attempts to extract blood, and in cases, samples were taken by collecting what was oozing from the hole in the punctured vein. Another sample is collected by allowing the bird to bleed from the wound onto a wing. A photo taken by Shorrock shows Wakelam's fingers are smeared in blood. The opportunities for contamination were too numerous for the samples to be considered reliable, according to Scott. The law at the time stated that only a veterinary surgeon was allowed to extract blood, unless there was a specific exemption. Yet, there was none. On the warrant, Wakelam is described as a veterinary nurse and gives the address of the practice in Northumberland that employed her, presumably to obscure the fact that a veterinary surgeon was not involved. She was said to have been acting for the RSPCA and not the practice, and the collection of blood samples was potentially illegal. Furthermore, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons was unable to trace any veterinary nurse named Anne Victoria Wakelam ever being registered, which was a legal requirement at the time of the raid. While it was supposed to be a police investigation, the case was orchestrated by Shorrock. He collected all the blood, stored it, transported it, and had it examined. Shorrock was in direct communication with the Department of Environment and the DNA testing lab run by David Parkin, a former RSPB trustee. The charity had been co-funding his research since 1987. Nothing was done by the police other than being present at the raid and interviews, which were also conducted by Shorrock. There was no active police investigation. Parkin's DNA testing system was also unverified. This concerned the Department of the Environment, which repeatedly told Shorrock and Parkin that it was not to be used in criminal cases, but the RSPB was adamant that it would use the results in court. At the end of the trial, the judge noted in his verdict that the conviction required genetic experts from Nottingham, acknowledging the fact that none of the other evidence was sufficient to convict Canning of any crime. In Wildlife Police, broadcast in 1999, Shorrock echoed this.
Mr. Canning was a very difficult person to deal with, and I have absolutely no doubt that without DNA we would never have got him to court and we would never successfully prosecuted him.
But Shorrock's endorsement came 2 years after a laboratory of the Government Chemist review of Parkin's lab's testing found it could easily lead to false negatives and false positives, making it utterly useless. By the year 2000, nobody was using it. More information on Derek Canning's case and others can be found in RSPB Uncovered, the Missing Birdcrime Files.